Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Crump, and today's date is May 2nd, 2019. I am at Grandview Middle School in Hickory, North Carolina, interviewing Dr. Ric Vandett about his military experiences in the Air Force during the Vietnam War. Thank you for joining us today. Before we go any further, could you spell your full name?
First name is Ric, R-I-C, and last name is Vandett, V-A-N-D-E-T-T.
Thank you. Would you tell me a little bit about your childhood, family, and where you grew up?
I am the oldest of 5 children of a single parent. My mother raised 5 kids, and it was a difficult time for us. This is back in the 1950s, and we lived in a housing project, and we were on welfare for about 6 years, from the time I was 10 until I was 16, and that was it's a difficult time for us, but I had a mother who was very strong, very intelligent, and she demanded a lot of us that we be successful in school and not use our background and where we lived as an excuse not to be successful.
What was it like? Do you remember like what it was like growing up in that type of area with that many siblings? Like, did you have to share rooms in the house?
We had there were 3 bedrooms in the apartment that we had in the projects. I shared a bedroom with my brother, John. We had bunk beds, and I was the oldest, so I got to sleep on top. And my sisters, the 3 sisters, had a room to themselves, and my mother had her own room. Had only 1 bathroom, and back then that was normal. Now people have 4 or 5 bathrooms in a house, but we had 1, and trying to schedule times so everybody could get in and out of there, especially on school days when we all had to get ready, and I was very, very fussy about how I looked. And my hair had to be just perfect before I would even walk out to walk to school. And so I would spend probably more time than I needed combing my hair in the morning, which drove my sisters nuts. But I had a lot of friends, a lot of young guys that I hung around with in the project, and girls, and it was not a bad time. I can look back at that time with fond memories.
All right. Did you have any family members in the military?
I had a brother who served in Vietnam after I got home. Had an uncle who served in the Navy in World War II, and a cousin who served during peacetime in the Army in the mid-1950s.
What influenced your decision to enlist in the military, and why did you choose the Air Force?
The decision to enlist in the military was about the last option that I had at the time. I was 17 years old when I graduated from high school, but living in the housing project, we were sort of looked on as people who could not be successful in college, and that was not an opportunity for me at the time. But I also was a pretty lazy young man, and I didn't necessarily want to go looking for jobs. And my mother got very upset with me that here I was out of high school and not working and not in school. And after a while, her constant nagging made me make a choice. And really, the only choice back in 1962, at least for me, was the military. And I knew I did not want to be in the Army. I didn't want to go to the Marines. I could not see myself on a ship in the Navy, and the Air Force was basically what was left. And since I didn't want to do Army things, I enlisted in the Air Force. And it kind of backfired on me because after 6 months of training, the Air Force assigned me to the Army, where I spent the last 3.5 years in the Army, the last year of which was in Vietnam.
If you had not enlisted, do you think you would have been drafted?
That's a very good question. The time was 1962. And the chances of me being drafted were very high, because if I had not gone to college and had not gone in the military, I'm sure I would have eventually have gotten a job. But by the time I was 20, the draft was getting started. And so in all likelihood, probably between the years of 20 and 23, I more than likely would have been drafted and spent 2 years in the Army.
Prior to enlisting, did you have any understanding of the geopolitical situation in Vietnam?
I did not. And again, this goes back to 1962, and of course I was 17, and the concept of geopolitical awareness was not something I could have even spelled at the time when I was 17. I knew very little about what was going on around the world, and certainly knew nothing about Vietnam at that time, as I would guess most Americans back at that time had probably never heard of Vietnam at all. It only took a few years later, however, and then all Americans were very much aware of Vietnam, but at that age I was not very much aware at all.
Okay. When you enlisted in the military, how did your friends and family react? Were they supportive?
My mother was very supportive, although she thought that was a bit drastic for me. She would have preferred I had either gone to college or gotten a job, but there really were no options in my own mind. But I was 17, so she had to sign for me because I was not old enough to sign for myself to go in. But she supported me 100%, and as did my friends, many of whom eventually joined the military themselves after a few years. But I had the support of family and friends to do so at the time.
Were you nervous about going in and joining the service?
I was a little apprehensive when I went in, and I keep referring to the fact that I was 17 only because I was immature, and leaving home was a big step for me. And I was living on Long Island, and I had to take a train all by myself at the tender age of 17 and go into New York City. And they had a big recruiting station on Whitehall Avenue in New York. And once I had enlisted, I had to take the train to that place. And even looking back on it now, I'm surprised that I had the courage to be by myself walking along in the streets of New York City, finding the building and walking in the building and finding out where I had to go at that point, where there were hundreds of other young men my age and older who were enlisting at the same time as I was. I was a little bit apprehensive because I didn't know what I was getting into at that time.
Okay. What do you remember about your time in basic training?
I remember having very little time to myself. They woke us up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we had to pull the covers up on our bed, but they didn't give us enough time to make our bed. They marched us to chow. We had breakfast at 5:15 in the morning, and back, I think, around 6 o'clock. And at that point, we had to get our bunks ready for inspection, take our showers and shave and everything. And I got to the point where I didn't like having to shower with everybody else and fight for time for everything. And I used to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'd get ready at that time. So when the 5 o'clock whistle blew, I was ready to go out there. So all I had to do when I came back from chow was to get my bunk in the area ready for inspection. I do remember that the sergeants were very strict, very demanding. And one day we were in formation, and the sergeant said to somebody, "Jump." And the guy jumped. And when he came down, the sergeant said, "I didn't tell you could come down." Well, I thought that was funny, so I started to laugh. Well, he got mad at me for laughing, and he made me, and he said, "Wipe that smile off your face." And I went like that. He said, "Now dig a hole and bury that smile." I had to dig a hole, I had to bury the smile, I had to put the dirt back over my smile, and I had to stand in attention and make sure I would never laugh again. And me, being a wise guy, I'm thinking to myself, this is the dumbest thing I've ever had to go through. But it was the sergeant's way of instilling discipline in the ranks. You laughed when you were allowed to laugh, and not when you wanted to laugh, so to speak. And it was their way of making sure that everybody did the same thing at the same time, and that we all obeyed whatever orders that the sergeant gave us.
Could you describe your job and any training you received related to your specialty?
The training as far as the job, when I finished regular basic training, I was sent to an Air Force base in Illinois, where I was trained to be a weather observer. And what the job entailed was learning how to look at the sky and tell what kinds of clouds there were, what threats they might be to any kind of aircraft or storms that might be coming up, what the wind direction and velocity was, what the temperature, the humidity, and use as much information as I could gather and give it to the forecasters. We had to take the information that we had. We had to record it on a big, what looks like a spreadsheet today.
Can you come to the office, Marcel? Please come to the office. Thank you.
It would look like an Excel spreadsheet today. We would fill it out, and we actually would take that information and type it onto a machine that was a teletype machine. The teletype machine would print out a ribbon, and we would put the ribbon into a fax machine, different from the fax machines we have today, a facsimile machine, and that information would go out all over the country. And so that weather forecasters all over the country would get that information from every reporting station. They could then take that information and plot it on a big weather map and tell where the cold fronts, warm fronts, and all the information was, where the serious weather might be. And I learned to this day, I could tell you how high clouds are and when the storms are coming and such. But that was good information, valuable information to supply to pilots. And I thought that's what I would be doing on an Air Force base the rest of my career. And while I stayed in meteorology, in weather, I got assigned to the Army, and my life changed because then I had to go into the field to learn how to do the same kinds of things that machines were able to tell me. Now I had to be able to eyeball things and do it with handheld equipment in the woods and jungles and things of that nature. So that was the kind of, I was then trained for when I went to Vietnam to be able to do the same kinds of things. Wherever there were helicopters in the field, I had to be with them.
Prior to leaving for your tour of duty in Vietnam, what had you heard about the situation on the ground from fellow military members?
Prior to my going, we began in this country to hear a whole lot more about Vietnam. I even met somebody who came back from Vietnam. He was what they called an advisor in that kind of capacity at that time. He wasn't a fighter or anything, but he would tell us what the country was like. But many of us began studying more about Vietnam and realized that there had been fighting and wars in that country for 50-some years. The French were there prior to the United States being there. The Japanese were there. Other countries had been involved in that area. China had been involved there. And we began to learn more. And at that time, it wasn't just Vietnam, it was South Vietnam and North Vietnam. There were two separate countries. And the North was trying to unify the entire country by taking over the South. The North was communist. We learned that much. And back when I was in the military, communism was a very, very, very bad word. We didn't want anybody to be communist. And so the South Vietnamese were trying not to be communist, and they were asking for our help to make sure they didn't get taken over. And that was about as much as I knew about the country. I knew very little about the culture of the country. I just knew about where it was geographically, and that things were getting pretty heavy over there at that time.
When you did get to Vietnam, did the culture there surprise you in any way?
A little bit. I was surprised by the beauty of the country. The city of Saigon was a beautiful country, pretty much French architecture, that was built for about 400,000 people, but by the time I got there, there were over 1 million people. It was a very, very crowded city. The culture was different as far as little things like hand gestures, that if I went like this, that meant in American, I want you to go away. In Vietnamese, this means come here. So the first time I saw somebody do this, I started walking the other way. And she thought I was the stupidest person in the world because she kept saying, come here, I'm going the other way. But finally I learned those little kinds of things. It was okay for men to hold hands if they're friends. again, that's a different culture than in which I grew up. And I learned one time I was with a South Vietnamese soldier, and he wanted to hold my hand because he wanted to be my friend. And from a cultural standpoint, that was difficult for me to do, but I realized I was in his country, and I wanted to show respect at that time. So just learning how people do things differently and what's important. It was a good experience for me to learn that.
What do you remember about your flight from San Francisco to South Korea?
That's a good question. I don't remember much about my flight except I lost my hat. I had a hat when I had to take a cab to the airport, and I had some important papers in my hat. So I took my hat off to get the papers and put my hat on top of the cab and got into the cab, and the cab took off, and I forgot. I had the papers. Thank goodness I didn't lose those, but I did lose my hat. The flight over was fairly uneventful. Going to Korea, the flight from Korea to Vietnam was a little more eventful. I was a little more nervous. I was not nervous going to Korea because I thought that's where I would spend the last year in the military. But I was only there for 3 weeks before they transferred me to Vietnam. That flight, I was a little bit more apprehensive for a couple of reasons. One, I was going to a war zone, which by this time I knew what was going on. Number two, they gave me a rifle but didn't give me any ammunition for it. I thought, that's kind of useless. So when I got to Saigon, I had an M14 rifle with no ammunition. The young man who picked me up in a Jeep had ammunition, but it was for an M16 rifle. It didn't fit mine, and I did not feel real comfortable there with a weapon with no ammunition until I got to the main headquarters, and they gave me the equipment the rifle that I needed.
What did you do in South Korea before entering Vietnam?
Again, I was a weatherman, a weather observer at a weather station at a small base in South Korea, and the normal reporting of weather. I would work an 8-hour shift, and we'd have to take observations at least twice an hour, and again, simply report those on the teletype machines, and it was a good experience. In fact, it was such that I thought that I might want to get into meteorology when I got out of the military. I was a little apprehensive because I was told that you needed to be pretty good in math if you want to be a meteorologist, and I was not a very good math student, and I was wondering about going to college and taking math. I wasn't 100% sure I could do that, but then of course Vietnam changed everything for me.
Did you experience culture shock when you arrived in South Korea and Vietnam?
A little bit, only because the language was different, and I had to understand customs. In other words, how we do things around here, so to speak. There are differences in the United States from different parts of the country. People do and say things differently, and it was having to learn. But I respected the fact that I was in somebody else's country, so I wanted to learn their language and I wanted to learn their customs.
Could you describe the duties and responsibilities while deployed in Vietnam?
The duties of the actual reporting of weather was the same, except now I was on the ground. I was not in a building. I was in a tent, and if I had to get information, I'd go outside and actually eyeball things. And often I would hand carry or over a headset calling to the pilots what the weather conditions were. I was actually the authority that would tell pilots whether they could get up in the air or not, they could fly. If I thought conditions were not favorable to them to fly, I would tell them so. Helicopter pilots were very, very, very brave people who thought they could fly in anything. And they would always try to bribe me or at least convince me that they could fly no matter what the conditions were. And so I would work with them as best possible, but I was concerned about their safety too. And as much as I knew about what the weather conditions were, because I'd often have to go with them. I have to get on the helicopter and fly with them to wherever they were going. So I wanted to make sure the conditions were good too, wherever we were going.
Could you describe a typical day while you were in Vietnam?
It's hard to say what a typical day was, but in essence, I was stationed at the base camp called On-K. It's A-N, and the second word is K-H-E. And that was where the 1st Air Cavalry Division was based. Work there was pretty non-eventful. We would do our jobs. If we weren't on shift at the time, we would have things to do back at the base, or we would have time. We'd play volleyball, play football games. We'd read, drink beer occasionally, and relax and get to know each other. Things changed once we had to go out in the field on an operation. Things got a little bit more exciting at that point.
What was the difference from life on the base and life in the landing zone?
Life on the base, we got into a pretty good routine of doing our job, and life was often centered around mealtime. What are you going to do before breakfast? What are you going to have for breakfast? What are you going to do between breakfast and lunch? What are you going to have for lunch? We're going to do between lunch and dinner, and so on. And our meals, for the most part, at the main base were in the big mess tents. And they were pretty decent meals. The cooks, we'd get eggs and bacon and things like that for breakfast for most of the time. I can't recall specifically. I know at one time we got a plane load of steaks come in, and there was no way to keep them cold for a long period of time, so we had to have steak 2 or 3 times a day until they were all gone. But generally we had pretty good food. And during the day, if we weren't working, we could play touch football or tackle or whatever, volleyball. We'd read, hang around. We'd also go into the village. In the village, there were bars in the village, and being young men, we would take advantage of the bars and things that were available in the bars. And that was sort of like our normal life until we went into the field. And I would go to the landing zone. We would take supplies and troops to the landing zone, and from the landing zone area we'd set up a camp, and the infantry would go out from there, and I would stay back at the landing zone area. Life was a little bit different then. We were always working. There was no work 8 hours and time off. You worked until you went to sleep, and there were no ways to get involved in other things, recreation, so to speak, or reading books. You just always had to be on the alert at all times, and so it was a heightened sense of awareness. You never let your guard down during that time, and it's hard to stay that way for days on end without taking a really big deep breath and relaxing for hours at a time, which is what we could do once we got back to the normal base.
How did living on the base and living in the landing zone affect you?
Living in the landing zone area taught me I could rely on myself a lot more than I thought I could, because I was pretty much on my own. I would have my own equipment, but I'd have to set up the radio equipment. I'd have to set up everything to make sure that I could get the information to the pilots that they needed, and it taught me that I was better than I thought I was when I went in the military, that I could do more than I thought I could. And that I could depend on myself, and I could make decisions, because I ended up being sort of the team leader of the group. I could assign people to go, and I often assigned myself to go more than anybody else. But I knew that I had the leadership qualities that really were enhanced when I was out in the field more than I needed back at the base camp.
Would you be willing to describe your first time in combat?
Yeah, I'd be willing to describe it. It was about 5 minutes of pure chaos and pure hell, and then it was over with. We got hit one night at the landing zone area, and all we got were commands from officers that we were being hit from a certain area, and we had to fire in that area. And it was at night, and we could see the direction we were fighting only because of our tracer bullets. And a tracer bullet was every fifth bullet in the magazine was coated with a red phosphorus kind of coating that would glow at night, so you could see the bullets. Every fifth bullet you could see. Too many guys would fire on full automatic, which would mean a clip of 20 bullets would be gone in just a few seconds. And that's wasting ammunition. Semi-automatic, you go 3 bursts at a time. It's easier, and if you just one at a time, every fifth bullet you can see where it was going. And that helps you keep the direction in which you wanted to fire. It also helps you see where other guys were firing. And it's sometimes incoming, you could see incoming fire that way too. But I can look back on it now, the few times I was involved in those kinds of incidents, that I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to be scared. I was scared afterwards. It was all over with. My heart was beating very, very fast, and I was just glad things had come to a halt and I could take a deep breath. But while the fire was going on, I just reacted. I didn't really think much at all at the time.
Did you feel prepared for combat both mentally and physically?
Physically, very much so. Mentally, perhaps not as much, because unless you've been in combat, it's hard to get someone to understand what he or she would be going through in a combat situation. We would be talked to and told what to think about and prepare for, but until you actually get into it, it's like telling a football player this is what's going to happen to you, but until you get hit that first time, you don't know what it's like. But the military did as well as they could to prepare us for it, because again, I was not prepared to be in the infantry. I was not trained as an infantry person, and the quick training I got with an M16, how to qualify an M16 rifle, was a very, very short time before I was sent over there. Mentally, it's hard to prepare somebody mentally for a situation like that. You just have to go through it.
How common was it to take fire while flying in the helicopters?
It wasn't that common, depending upon where you were. Closer to the landing zone, obviously, you have more opportunities to take fire. But further out, once the helicopters, once you got into a landing zone, the purpose of the landing zone was to have some place from which to deploy the infantry troops and the combat troops, and a place for them to come back to. But the helicopters then, once the battles were being fought, would then leave from the landing zone to go out to where the soldiers were fighting, and they took fire a great deal once they were trying to pick up and drop soldiers off in the actual zones where the combat was occurring.
How did it feel emotionally knowing that you were often in harm's way? Did this change your outlook on life?
It made me appreciate life more, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't live every day in Vietnam thinking I was in harm's way. You get into a routine, and from a mental aspect, you try to divorce yourself from that thought that, I might get killed today. I didn't, at least. Most people didn't think about it that way. When we were being hit, then you begin thinking about how things might happen to you. And then when I got where I only had about 6 weeks to go before I got home, then I began thinking about it a whole lot, because I was getting a little more nervous and apprehensive. I didn't want anything to happen. I was so close to going home. I was a little bit more careful at that time and thinking about it a little bit more. But most of the time, I didn't think about it.
Would you be willing to discuss any other major firefights that you were involved in?
There was nothing major that I was involved in as far as me shooting, other than the 3 times I was in. We did get hit once at On K, at the big base camp, but I didn't have to fire back. We got shelled, mortar shells coming in, and we could do nothing about it except get down and try to protect ourselves. from the fire. In fact, I still have one of those shells that landed about 15 yards away from me, 15 feet actually. It was closer to that. I still have it at home. But I dug out once the battle was over with and things got quiet. I dug it out and
Ron Miller, please come to the office. Ron Miller, please come to the office.
and I kept it for myself. It's a little show and tell I have. Sometimes I still use to this day.
How did it affect the unit when you lost fellow service members?
That was a tough part. We lost two of our own guys, and one of the very strange things, when I was in a place called the Iodine Valley, I need to tell you about that. When we got hit and the shells were coming in, this was a prelude to a major battle that happened in November of 1965 in a place called the Iodine Valley. A movie was made of that called We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson. It was about that battle in the Iodine Valley and with the 1st Air Cavalry Division. That was in November of 65. In January of 66, that's where I went. I went to that particular area, and forgive me, give me the question again.
Sorry.
So,
How did it affect the unit when you lost
okay, you
fellow
lost people,
soldiers?
thank you. And the reason I mentioned Iodine Valley is because when I was there in January of 66, I received a call, and they wanted to know where Sergeant Vandett's replacement should be. And I answered the call, I said, that's me. And they had gotten a report that I was killed. And they were ready to send my replacement, and I said, no, it's me. And when my friends heard that I was killed, it bothered them a great deal. We shared that story when I got back, and I was really worried that my mother would be told that I had died in combat. And I was so afraid that the word would go that way that I don't know how that happened, how it was reported that I was killed, but anytime you lose somebody you know, it brings not only your own mortality into play, but you realize that people whom you had just had breakfast with maybe the day before are no longer with you, and that's hard to take sometimes.
Could you spell the Iodine?
Iodine is 2 words. I-A is the first word, Aya, and last word is Drang, D-R-A-N-G, the Iodine Valley. And it was a very, very famous place, made more famous, and the reason the movie was made, and it was from a book called We Were Soldiers Once and Young, is because that was the first time that North Vietnamese regular army soldiers were in battle. Up until that particular point, Americans had been fighting against the Viet Cong, which were South Vietnamese rebels. And it was the rebels against the South Vietnamese army until November of 1965. In that battle, our troops met the North Vietnamese well-seasoned troops for the first time, and it was a pretty bad 3-day battle.
How rare was it to have members of the Air Force working directly with the Army helicopters?
Very, very rare. We were the only people doing it. Mainly because the Army did not train anybody to be weather observers. And again, they weren't thinking about war. Prior to Vietnam, and prior to there being a United States Air Force, during World War II, there was the Army Air Corps. And the Army and the Air Corps worked together. Well, the Army kept, at all of its Army bases, they kept airstrips. And they kept planes. And now they started having helicopters. But they didn't train anybody to do what I did. The Marines didn't train anybody either, but the Navy did. So there was always a Navy weather person wherever the Marine, if there was a Marine aircraft someplace, there had to be a Navy weather person, weather observer. And the Air Force did the same for the Army, but we're the only, I think each major division had a detachment of people just like me.
How were you treated by the Army members?
For the most part, fine. We were all in the same area, eating the same food, being under the same attacks, and so on and so forth. So we were respected, and of course we respected them a great deal.
Did you feel respected by the pilots, and did they appreciate your services?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. They needed what we had to provide for them, so they were extremely nice to us, to say the least, because they wanted to fly. Some of the best heroes to come out of Vietnam were the helicopter pilots. They wanted to fly no matter what the weather was, and I would do everything in my power to make sure they got off, that they could fly, because I knew what the job they were doing for other people. But there was a healthy respect for us, and all of us respected them, because they would put themselves in harm's way a lot, not thinking about their own safety so much as trying to protect and save Americans who were in danger.
Were there any times that the pilots didn't want to listen to you and like they went instead?
That's a good question. I can't think of any one time, because the only time that I really was insistent was when it was heavy fog, when you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. And that was just too dangerous. And they respected that, but they would keep telling me, it's getting better, it's getting better, I think I can fly. And I would just have to use my best judgment, because I wanted to protect them too. If they could get above the fog, it was okay. But they'd have to land again to pick up troops and have to get through the fog. And that was not safe for them or the troops they were trying to save.
Would you talk about your injury while playing football in Vietnam and how it helped you get a job with the United Parcel
Service? The story I tell people is when I got out of the military, I went to Los Angeles, and I applied for a part-time job at United Parcel Service. I was interviewed for the position, and I was told that if I passed the physical, that I would get the job. And they had a doctor on site, and I went to see the doctor, and I took off my shirt, and he saw a scar that went across my body like this. And he said, "What's that? How'd you get that?" I said, "I got it in Vietnam." He said, "Well, you've got the job, son." I said, "Thank you, sir." And I didn't tell him I got it playing football, and that's what happened. I didn't lie to him. He said, "How'd you get it?" I said, "I got it in Vietnam." He may have assumed I was in a battle, but that was his assumption. I didn't lie. What happened was I was playing football, and I was going out for a pass. I didn't have a shirt on. It was shirts versus skins kind of thing. And I didn't have a shirt on, and I went back and looked over my shoulder and put my hands up and caught the pass in my hand. As the ball hit my hand, I hit a tent rope. We had an imaginary goal line. That was that tent over there and this tent over here, and that was the goal line in between. And I was too close to this tent and hit it, and the tent rope was on an angle. I hit that tent rope going full speed. I was pretty quick back then. And I hit it so hard that my legs came up and the top half of my body went over, and I was literally hanging on that rope. I still had the ball. That was a touchdown. I was so proud of myself that I didn't drop the ball. But it was I hit it so fast and so hard that it was a rope burn. And that happened like in April of 1966, and the interview for the job was in February 1967. So it was almost a year later. I still had that dark scar that went across my chest, and it was a severe rope burn, and it helped me get a job. And I did not lie to the doctor. I said I got it in Vietnam, which I did.
How long did that scar last?
The dark part of the scar lasted almost 2 years. And then when it finally, the dark scab and everything went away, they had a white line that went through. And I have normally dark skin in the summertime, especially. I tanned pretty easily back then. And so I'd be tanned all over except for that one white line that would go across. And eventually, about 2 years later after that, I think it was finally gone. But it was a severe rope burn.
How were you treated after returning from Vietnam? Were you affected by any of the anti-war protests?
I was affected by it, and I've heard stories of people returning from Vietnam being spit at and called baby killers. I was never spit at. I was never called a baby killer. But I did run into some difficult times. I went to Los Angeles with a friend of mine that I'd met in Vietnam, enrolled at a junior college, Los Angeles Valley Junior College, and the night before we attended class, we walked around the campus, and there was a draft card burning ceremony and a flag burning ceremony at the school's flag. And it was a protest against Vietnam. It was being led by one of the instructors. And they were just throwing things, burning draft cards, and protesting the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was not a popular war in this country. And many people in this country were protesting against it. And this one college professor was doing so. The very next morning, the first day of class, I happened to be in his class. And he announced to the class that he was very anti-Vietnam, and people who did not support and agree with him would probably not pass this class, and it would be a good idea for people to leave. And I got up and left. And I just, rather than argue with him, I just got up and left. I ended up joining the Veterans Club on campus to be around people more like myself who had been involved in Vietnam, or at least had been in the military, and who were not protesting. But facing the protesters was, and just facing people who just didn't like the fact that we were in Vietnam. They were blaming the Vietnam veterans for the war rather than blaming the politicians who sent us over there.
How did the card burning and the protest make you feel personally?
It got me very angry. Again, like I said, you didn't have to blame people like me for the war. We just supported our country. We served our country. But a concentrated effort on people to say, you can draft me if you want, I'm not going. I'm not going to serve my country, really bothered me. I understood why Vietnam was an unpopular war. While I was over there, I saw things I didn't like that I didn't think were going to help us win the war. But it didn't make me want to march against the war when I came home. And it bothered me that there were people who so disrespected our country that they would burn their draft cards. I've often said that you don't have to hate the warrior to hate the war. And all too often, the Vietnam veterans were the warriors who were hated because we were in Vietnam. And we never got the welcome home that World War II veterans got, or that the people coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan today are being treated with much more respect than we were.
While in Vietnam, did you ever come in contact with the civilians? If so, could you describe these interactions?
I came in contact with a lot of civilians, most of which were very positive experiences. I did run across a couple of young teenagers who were trying to steal things from other Americans, and we had enough people to put a stop to that. But for the most part, the people were very nice, very friendly, very much appreciative of the American presence, especially in Saigon and in the villages of An Khe, the village of An Khe. Treated with a lot of respect, and I was very glad that I got to meet the people I did. I even had a girlfriend. I met a girl in Saigon, and fell in love, as it were, for a short time. But again, the people were very nice.
We understand that you are actively involved with veteran organizations helping other veterans. Could you talk about your involvement with veteran organizations?
The prime organization to which I belong, am co-chair of, is the Foothills Veterans Helping Veterans. And we are, as our name implies, we are veterans who help other veterans. We meet every Friday morning at 10 o'clock at their Hickory Soup Kitchen, and I invite all people, all veterans, to come, of any era, to come. And even if you're not a veteran, we have people who we call that are allies, friends. Anybody who wants to help veterans is welcome. And our job is to connect people to the services that are available in Catawba County, and there are many services. We try to connect people to jobs if they need a job, help them with transportation, help them with their education, help them find housing and things of that nature. When people are having a difficult time, we do what we can to help them. I belong to other Vietnam organizations. I belong to Vietnam Veterans of America and a local AMVETS chapter here, just to stay involved because I respect what veterans have done. And I'm in a position where I can help other veterans now, and so are some of my friends, and that's what we try to do. We try to make sure that no veteran is ever forgotten.
In your opinion, what does it mean to serve honorably?
I like you using the word honorably. It meant a lot to serve. I am proud that I served my country. Was I nervous? Was I scared? Yes. Leaving home at 17 was not a comfortable situation for me. Did not know what I was getting into, but I look with pride on the fact that I am one of millions of Americans in the history of this great country who said yes and was willing to serve, and I'm very proud of that fact.
What advice would you give any student thinking about joining the military?
I would ask them to consider it very carefully, but also to look at it as an opportunity to grow. I needed that time. I was very immature at 17 and very mature at 21, and the difference was my time in the military. The experiences that forced me to grow up. Now, of course, when you say to someone about enlisting in the military, you also have to be conscious of what's going on in the world at the time. If there's a war going on, you really want to think twice about doing it, because when you serve your country, there's always a chance of putting a life on the line. And if you know that going into it, then by all means, go ahead and serve your country. But please go in with your eyes wide open. But it also is a good experience because it can help someone who's not sure what he or she wants to do in life to grow up.
Are there any other stories, experiences, or thoughts you would like to share with us today?
The snake stories come to mind, first of all. I had 3 encounters with snakes that were pretty interesting. One was that there was a small snake. Well, let me put it this way. At night, if a guy had to go to the bathroom, there was an area to go. And there was a guard who would guard the area. And there was a well-worn path to the area where guys could go and relieve themselves. And on the way back from relieving himself, one guy had a flashlight so he could see where he was going, saw a snake. And it was a poisonous snake. And he got upset and he yelled to the guard, and the guard shined his light. He could see it, and for a while there was a lot of noise and yelling going on back and forth, and those of us who were sleeping in the tents, we could hear it. And we knew something was going on. Then we started yelling about a snake. And finally, and the snake would go toward one, and the guy would back up, and the snake would go toward the other. He was keeping both guys away. And finally, the guard had a rifle, and he was able to club it. He didn't want to fire his rifle, because again, you start firing a rifle in the middle of a war zone, people get a little nervous about that. But he was able to take the butt of his rifle and kill that snake. But we heard all about it, and one of my friends actually skinned the snake and made a hat band out of it. The second one, I went into a bar in the village of Ankei, and it was kind of dark, and when you go into a dark place, your eyes start to focus for a while, and I put my foot on top of what I thought was a bar rail. It turned out to be a cage that had a big python in it. And we had that python we took back to our main camp, and we bought a chicken so that we could see the snake eat the chicken. The snake did not eat the chicken. Instead, the snake just coiled up, and the chicken sat on top of it for hours. And then we were told we had to get rid of the snake, and one of our guys reached in, and the python bit him, and he had to get a gangrene shot for that. But we actually had to airlift in a helicopter that python out of the way. And the third and last one happened to me personally. We had this 13-man tent, a huge tent where 13 guys slept. It had space for 14 people, but between me and the other guy, there was a big pallet full of, we put all our duffel bags on it. All our luggage was on that pallet. And I went back in because I didn't want to watch this movie they were watching. And when we put this huge tent up, there was a tree stump about so high, and a little twig come out of the tree stump. I put my cot up against that so that I could lean up against it just like this and read a book if I wanted to. And I put my legs out like this on my cot and read a book. And that's what I was doing. A guy comes in, his name was Willie, he was our driver, and I said, "Hey" to Willie, and he didn't say anything to me at all. And I thought he was real stuck up. I'm reading my book, and I see him out of the corner of my eye because he has the other bunk on the other side of the luggage. And I see him step over the bags with a rifle and book. My legs go down, my feet hit, and I stand straight up to fight with Willie. I turned around, and what I see was Willie's rifle go, and it hit a snake, which was on this tree stump, right in the bend. It was a poisonous one, right in the back of my neck. When I said hey to Willie when he came in, he didn't want to say, "Oh, there's a snake behind you." He didn't want me to move at all. And so I was really big, macho, brave guy, jumping up and down on my cot going, "Kill it, kill it, kill it." My voice got real high, and I was just looking at it. But he actually saved me. I don't know if it would have killed me, but it would have harmed me a great deal since it was a venomous snake. And I remember telling my mother the story, and she actually sent him more Christmas presents than she sent me.
Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I thank Mr. Fisher and all the students for this effort. Thank you very much.